2024 was a great year for game releases, and I knew that for my next video, I wanted to talk about at least one of these games that was released this year, but I wasn't sure which one to pick. When thinking about the games that I really enjoyed the most, I quickly noticed something that they all had in common. Now, being a huge fan of Atlus, and specifically their Megaton games, I wasn't surprised at the quality of the games that released, but I was surprised at just how many great games came out back to back in just one year. Atlus had quite the hot streak this year, and so I figured, why not? Instead of picking one game, I'll just talk about all the Atlus games that I played this year. It gives me the perfect excuse to just gush about some really good games, and even recommend them to you if you're even just a little bit curious about them. Before we get started, these won't be story reviews of the games, but just my general thoughts and feelings about them. So with that, let's get into it. Atlus really started the year strong with the release of Persona 3 Reload. Persona 3 is a game that is pretty special to me. I love the characters and the story, and Fez is just one of my favorite games in general. Coincidentally, the week the game came out, things just happened to work out for me where my entire week was free, and I was able to just set up camp in front of my computer and just binge Persona 3 Reload. As a huge fan of the originals, I went in knowing that Reload wouldn't be a one-to-one remake of the original. For some reason, the creators wanted to preserve the original Persona 3 experience, and for those who don't know, that would be like remaking Persona 4 or 5 and not including Golden or Royal content. This meant that most of the Fez content and portable content wouldn't be included, which I will say was disappointing because one of the biggest benefits of a Persona 3 remake would be not having to choose a version and just have one ultimate edition of Persona 3. But despite that disappointment, I gotta admit, I still had a great time re-experiencing Persona 3. I swear, the game is like a weakness of mine. No matter the version or even adaptation, I just know I'll be satisfied at the end of the day. Now, I don't want it to sound like the only things Reload brings to the conversation is what they didn't do, because there are many great things added in this version of Persona 3. To just list a few things, every new song was amazing, and social links being completely voiced breathed new life into the characters that I already knew. One of my favorite additions was definitely the added hangouts with the Guy party members, my favorite being the Shinjiro hangouts, because I just love seeing the original Cease members interact. With all the differences that this game has, Persona 3 Reload ultimately felt like another version of Persona 3 to pick from, and not a replacement, which is okay. I'd honestly say that the best part about Reload is that more people can experience one of my favorite games. It was really cool being able to share the same experiences that I had way back with a bunch of my friends who had never played the games before. There are some good changes, questionable changes, and some changes that were simply different, but at the end of the day, any version of Persona 3 is peak fiction in my opinion, and I'm glad that it exists. Oh man, where do I begin with Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance? I guess it would be some context on why Vengeance needed to happen. I was a huge fan of this game back when it was just originally 5, and I would even say that it was one of my favorite Shin Megami Tensei games, which I gotta admit was kind of embarrassing because it was like a guilty pleasure. Don't get me wrong, I love so many things about 5. The roster, the gameplay, just seeing the demons in the overworld. It's probably the only SMT game that I 100%ed. More than just seeing all the endings, I did every quest, completed the compendium, beat the super bosses. It was just a fun time. But I'd say most of all, I fell in love with the core concept of the game. The problem was that as strong as the concept was, the story felt like it kinda just flopped. Especially in the final act, and most of the endings weren't very satisfying, just serviceable. The alignment reps kind of just existed, and there were multiple characters that just felt wasted. It was a game that I enjoyed, but couldn't help but think about the potential that the game had. What could have been? And apparently I wasn't the only one who felt this way, because none other than the director of the game himself said that he was also disappointed with the final result. but still wanted to create the game that the team had originally envisioned. And that makes a lot of sense to me, because I'd argue that even more than other Atlus re-release games, Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance feels like a passion project from the development team. In my opinion, they went way more than above and beyond for this release. In addition to including the original game's story, Vengeance would add completely new story that mainly diverges around the time that the original felt like it began to fall off. The alignment reps were honestly such an improvement and traveled with the player as guest party members. But not only the alignment reps, other characters got to shine in this version too. Vengeance was more than just a story fix though. They added so many new and returning demons to the series, passive abilities, fusion attacks, the ability to interact through demons outside of combat, a crazy new game plus mode after defeating an added super boss, and so many quality of life improvements, there was no exaggeration, like 50 features and adjustments. And then, as I was making this video, a free update months later released to add requested demons as your navigators in the overworld, as well as a new quest. Plus, a demo for the game just because they could. As a huge fan of the original 5, despite its apparent flaws, I kinda felt validated. This was the game I always knew that it could be, and can very proudly say now that it is one of my favorite Shin Megami Tensei games. When I first played Persona 3, there was an epilogue to the story titled The Answer. While many people online were very vocal about not liking this added story, I really enjoyed it and its message. Plus, it solidified Aigis and Yukari in my top 3 Persona characters. People would say that it was an unnecessary addition or that it ruined the characters, but I didn't really agree with those takes. Everyone felt, I don't know, vulnerable and human, which really added to my enjoyment of the cast. As a The Answer defender, a part of me had always hoped that if the games were ever remade, a modern audience might receive the answers a little differently and enjoy the story like I did. So its exclusion from Persona 3 Reload was probably my biggest disappointment in the remake. Then, a day after March 5th, which is the last in-game day of Persona 3, they announced the DLC episode Aigis The Answer, and I was mostly hyped. It was cool to give The Answer the same shine that base Persona 3 had with the remake, along with all the added content like hanging out with the cast members to break up the dungeon crawling. They also added a neat optional feature to bring over personas from your main file, which I'm sure many people appreciated. In my opinion, the biggest upgrade was the character Metis. While she didn't really change much, I feel that they really emphasized on her as being a clingy little sister to Aigis. Her additional scenes and the dungeon dialogue with the party really highlighted that part of her character, and I gotta say, I really liked it. Before, I was a fan of Metis because I was a fan of The Answer, kinda like tied together, but now I could genuinely say that I like Metis. She's a nice addition to the team. There were a few complaints that the DLC felt a bit sanitized in a few scenes, you know, a certain scene being less darker or a character being less abrasive. And while that is true, that is Reload in a nutshell. The atmosphere isn't quite the same as base Persona 3, and that's because, as I said earlier, it's not a replacement of Persona 3, it's just a new version of it. In the end, a few minor changes did not affect what I really liked about The Answer, and that was being the main message of the story. And so, none of the changes really affected my enjoyment. Overall, I would say that I got my wish from many years ago. I've seen quite a few people say that they enjoy The Answer story, so if you like Persona 3 Reload, I say give it a try. Metaphor ReFantazio is a game that for a while I didn't think would ever be real. I remember years ago stumbling upon the teaser that would eventually be Metaphor. I believe it was announced around the same time as the original SMT5 trailer and then just went silent. So there was a long gap of just waiting that many people began to believe that it had been shelved. But man, am I glad that the game was still being worked on. An Atlus game directed by Katsura Hashino, characters by Shigenori Sojima, and composed by Shoji Meguro. I mean, that's just an all-star team. What I really thought was cool is that Metaphor essentially serves as Atlus's 35th anniversary game, even if it came out like 3 years after the big anniversary. And I don't just say that because the collector's edition had anniversary merchandise. The game itself borrows so much from other Atlus games. Like in the combat, the game uses the press turn system from SMT. While outside of combat, there's a calendar system along with the equivalent of social links and social stats that Persona games have. There's even a whole part of the game that plays homage to Entry and Odyssey, and the list just goes on. I've seen many people describe it as a Persona game but fantasy, and I won't lie, when I do, there's a part of me that just wants to go, actually, because it's so much more than that. But at the same time, it's also not trying to be Persona or even SMT. Metaphor is both the culmination of Atlus's past work and also a game that stands high on its own merits. The world of Metaphor is fascinating and really takes full advantage of the fantasy setting. There are like 9 different tribes that are each distinctly unique with their own traits and customs. A big part of the game is showing how these tribes interact with each other and tackling topics such as social inequality. This allows for a pretty varied cast of main and supporting characters. I loved just about the entire cast. The party was fun and lovable, the followers all had interesting storylines, and the villain is probably one of my favorite villains I've seen in a long time. The villain Luis always felt that he was several steps ahead of everyone, and carried himself with so much charisma that it captivates both the people in-game and players alike. He's extremely driven, and while he may seem charming at first glance, he's unapologetically cruel and quite the sociopath. He was the perfect foil to the main character, who constantly goes out of his way to help anyone and everyone. Another thing that I really enjoyed about Metaphor was the monsters. While there are traditional fantasy monsters, Metaphor also has a special class of monster called humans that are typically bosses. These bizarre and uncanny creatures all have these crazy designs and make for memorable encounters. Apparently, they are heavily inspired by the artist Hieronymus Bosch, specifically his paintings depicting demons in hell. And you gotta admit, fighting a painter's concepts of hellspawn in a JRPG is such a cool and unique idea that really stands out. And in my opinion, that just sums up the Metaphor ReFantazio experience in a nutshell. A cool, unique idea that really stands out. Yo, thanks so much for sticking around. For a while, I kept changing ideas on what I wanted my next video to be, but after looking back at the year Atlus had, I started to get inspired. Heck, technically, Atlus did even more this year with the beta for the Chinese P5 gacha game, as well as the PC port of Aigis the First Mission. And I might as well mention the game Unicorn Overlord, which was created by Vanillaware, but is still published by Atlus. I've been wanting to do an Atlus video game topic for a while, so I'm glad that I did this video. Till the next one, later.